Who is the head of Hamas in Gaza? Who's the guy who's really at fault for all of this? The evil genius, I guess. I hate to say even the word genius. But his name is Yahya Sinwar. And it's a crazy story of who he is. And in this YouTube exclusive, I want to talk to Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, who is not only an IDF combatant commander, but he also was the head of the IDF International Spokesman's Unit. And as a lieutenant colonel in reserves, for the last 3 months or so, he has been on almost every program imaginable, explaining what Israel's doing in Gaza and in Lebanon and so forth, but also defending Israel against ludicrous and crazy attacks from the media. Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, you and I met years ago when you were full-time.
Still in uniform.
Still in uniform. Thank you so much. Let's focus on this guy, because there hasn't been, in my view, but maybe you would know better, much real a profile or extensive look at the man behind all this, Yahya Sinwar. What can you tell us about him? Let's start there.
I think your viewers maybe know Hassan Nasrallah from Hezbollah. They know Khamenei from the Iranian regime.
Right.
But who runs Hamas? Yeah. I think you're right.
He's, aside from the guys who live in
luxury
Doha,
hotels in Doha,
multi-million-dollar luxury suites, but this guy is living underground and committing genocide.
This guy is different.
No.
From what I know, and I'm second-hand here because I'm not an intel officer and I don't claim to be an expert, but I have had access to some Israeli intelligence, and I think I can share a few interesting things.
Okay.
So, not royalty by any means, very working class family, and even below that. So a man that has crawled and fought his way up the ladder. Most of the trail of his ascension to the top position in Gaza is a trail of blood. He was, amongst other things, in charge of counter-espionage and basically flushing out what they call collaborators, so basically Palestinians who were working with Israeli intelligence.
Or at least alleged to be.
Allegedly, exactly. And his personal job was to take care of them, interrogate, and then execute. And he has a lot of Jewish blood on his hands, but he also has a lot of Palestinian blood on his hands. And I've heard first-hand encounters of survivors and other people who were former Hamas telling of how he enjoyed it, the look of enjoyment as he was executing Palestinians. So this is a person who has obviously no trouble whatsoever, no problem with taking a human life, whether it is from his own people or what he would call an enemy. Appears to be a person who is quite Spartanic in his general being, less focused on the niceties and the amenities of life, unlike Hamas leaders outside of Gaza, who appear to have developed a liking for the finer parts of life, cars, food, hotels, etc. Yahya Sinwar, at least in terms of his image, is a person who is mission-oriented. His mission is to exterminate Jews and to defeat Israel. That is what he prioritizes.
So this is one of the ironic parts. He was actually in Israeli prison.
He was.
And when there was an exchange of about 1,000 or so Palestinian prisoners back to Hamas in return for Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier that had been captured in an operation on the border between Israel and Gaza and had been held for years. And it was
5 years,
5 years, in a horrifying situation. Yahya Sinwar was actually released in that prisoner exchange. And so what do we know about his time in prison? And what does that tell us about the fact that it was very painful, the number of prisoner releases we've had to do just to get out the number of hostages that we have just in this operation, this war.
I think first of all it puts into question the historic wisdom of releasing terrorists back to become terrorists. And that's a whole other discussion. Yahya Sinwar is perhaps the worst example of a criminal, a terrorist that was apprehended by Israel, held in Israeli prisons, and then was released by Israel.
As absurd. Came back with a vengeance.
Came back with a diabolic vengeance and has been wreaking havoc not only in Israel but all over the region ever since. The man speaks Hebrew. The man received higher education in an Israeli prison. Israeli prisons are great places to get a higher, beyond high school education.
I didn't know that. That's.
And unfortunately, Israel has a very generous program based on the belief that if you educate a person, if you provide him with a good, life understanding and tools for his life, then that person will be a better person.
I won't ask you to comment on this, but what they should be doing in these prisons is converting them to Jesus. But I won't ask you as an IDF officer, and even in the reserves.
I don't know if they would be, if they would be welcoming to that, but
no, I'm sure they wouldn't. But
but
we look at just to give you an example of Mossab Hassan Yusuf.
Yes,
that was a dramatic example. I mean, not that it was Israel's intention, but he did realize how horrible Hamas was in an Israeli prison, and came to faith eventually in Christ. And I don't know how he's doing spiritually right now. I haven't talked to him, but I'm just saying, his whole mindset shift makes him one of the best spokesmen against Hamas that there is.
Yes.
But anyway,
as authentic as they come, the son of Hamas, as he's called in his book. So Yahya Sinwar, he speaks, reads, and writes and understands Hebrew. He studied Israeli society. Like many other terrorists, spent a lot of time in understanding the social fabric of the state of Israel, the different so-called tribes, the politics, the background, the different tensions and fault lines that exist in Israeli society, and all of that knowledge he took with him, and I think it was part of his planning and part of his leadership over Hamas and what he has been building Hamas towards. I think he also took with him an ability to assess how Israelis were trying to persuade themselves what Hamas really was about. And, the famous or the notorious conception, right? That Israel failed to see reality as was reflected from intelligence reports before October the 7th, and chose to assess the red flags as, well, this really isn't it, and Hamas really is all about,
and just to be clear for our audience, the concept that there were almost no combat soldiers on the Gaza-Israeli border on the morning of the 7th. There were just basically, effectively a handful of 18 and 19-year-old girls watching computer monitors, keeping an eye out. If I had written a novel like this, Jonathan, I've sold 5 million copies of my books. If I'd written a novel and described an invasion by Hamas into Israel, killing 1,200 people, butchering them, my own publisher wouldn't have published it because they said, Joel, look, you can make up anything. It's fiction. I get it. But it has to be plausible. Yeah. It seems implausible. And yet, he found a way to lure Israeli leaders, civilian, military intelligence, into a true false sense of security.
Yeah. Yeah. And
that's the evil genius I'm talking about.
I agree with you that it was so inconceivable that even when it was happening, I think that Israeli military commanders and Israeli elected officials failed to understand, even whilst it was on display in front of them, the magnitude of what Hamas actually was doing. And only at the end of the first and second day did Israelis really understand what Hamas had planned and executed. The biggest terrorist attack and the highest amount of Israelis killed in Israeli history. The last time so many Jews were killed in one single day was during the Holocaust. That is the magnitude of this event, and this time there was supposed to be a military that was supposed to be there and defend them.
Is there any sense that this was primarily planned in Doha by the Hamas external leadership, or is this a Yahya Sinwar special?
There's a debate about that, but the opinions that I heard that I think have the highest level of credibility is that this was a Gaza-based and Gaza-generated idea that had outside support. Of course, weapons.
He wouldn't have done it without green light from
he couldn't have, because he needs weapons and explosives, and he needs diplomatic support, and he needs Qatari buy-in and diplomatic cover and willingness of the Qataris to wade into this horrible quagmire of the situation that Hamas has brought upon Gaza. So Yahya Sinwar studied Israeli society, and like many other terrorists, I think has a very good understanding of it. What I see when I look into his eyes and when I hear reports of survivors and people who have been close to his inner circle, it is a certain level of ruthlessness and lack of mercy. And I see it in his eyes, which I think is very, very indicative of the person he is. He is, of course, has training in military and terrorism, has quite a lot of experience in it.
Do we know if he spent any time outside of Israel and Gaza?
I know of lots of advice that he has been given inside Gaza.
Okay.
I think it's fair to assume that he has been outside of Gaza and received Iranian guidance, Syrian guidance, Hezbollah, etc.
But certainly his team has, because we know
his team has, of course.
There was training in Iran.
Totally. They're on a systematic basis. Higher education, engineering, but also military training, how to produce IEDs, how to manufacture rockets, how to fire, how to use weapons. All of that has been provided by Iran, inside Iran, but also in Syria, and in some cases, some small and specific cases, also in Lebanon together with Hezbollah. So he may or may not have been, well, let's assume that he was out, but I also know of many delegations of Iranian officials, of Hezbollah officials that made the visit to Gaza in order to share their knowledge and in order to educate and in order to be in that whole Iranian axis of terror that the Iranians have spent billions of dollars in building. And I think that they built quite a formidable net of enemies around Israel. Hamas was one of the largest. Hezbollah is the largest. Hamas wasn't built from the ground up by the Iranians. It was the Iranians kind of latched on to the success of Hamas.
Became a franchise.
Exactly.
Exactly. Hezbollah in the north, obviously in Lebanon, being initiated, funded, trained, armed as a Shia, sort of apocalyptic frontline force for the Shia apocalyptic Iranian, let's bring about the end of the world by destroying the Jews and the Christians regime, whereas Hamas started in 1988, Sunni, Muslim Brotherhood, connected to Egypt, so seemingly
different,
different, but became a key franchise player for Iran. We talked about how crazy it is that Israel actually had this guy, but also can you talk a little bit about the cancer treatment that he received in Israeli care? Most people don't know this story.
No, there was a story, this was on Israeli media, with an Israeli doctor at the prison services who saved Yahya Sinwar's life. He saved his life. He was in for, as you said correctly, cancer treatment, and he developed an infection. And this doctor was called upon in order to alleviate his situation.
Israeli doctor,
a Jewish Israeli doctor who spoke Arabic and could communicate with him. He saved his life. And I know that doctor was asked, do you regret saving his life? Now, after the 7th of October and what this monster has done and created and the actions that he set in, that he generated, he said, yes, of course, I regret it now, but I don't know if I could have, as a Jew, as an Israeli, to have acted any differently.
No, right. I mean, I don't think it's a doctor's job to take a
decide.
Life, right?
No.
That's a different game. Last question is, what do we know so far about his whereabouts? He must be moving.
He is
in these tunnels. Has the IDF come across places where they are confident he was? We know that one moment that was that's become public was Israeli hostages that were released talked about meeting him, and actually one of them saying, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" God bless that person. But
the courage.
What do we know so far?
We know that he is extremely careful and cautious. We know that he stays away from anything technological, phones, and anything that leaves a digital footprint. He knows how dangerous that is and can be, and how many terrorists have met their maker by using those kinds of tools. We know that he is very careful and I'd say suspicious of anything and everything in his surroundings, and he takes great precautions. That is probably what has enabled him to continue to live as far as he has.
Do we think that he was in the north at the beginning,
and
shifted down south, or
he most likely was? But the moment Israel announced that Israel was going to operate in the northern part of Gaza, Israel did that in order to allow civilians to leave.
Right.
But then that was, of course, more than enough warning for Yahya Sinwar to take his stuff and move through the elaborate tunnel network that Hamas has built under the Gaza Strip and to go south into a safer place of hiding. I think that the Israelis are currently, at the end of January, working under the assumption that he is somewhere under Khan Yunis or Rafah. Those are most likely the places that
those
where
battles
he is.
are pretty intense right now.
And there is intense fighting as we speak in and above and under Khan Yunis, not yet in Rafah. I think that there will be soon in Rafah as well. But that is probably where he is. But this is a very elusive character, very careful, very calculated. I think he understands both Israeli capabilities and Israeli weaknesses, militarily and political, and he is working according to those weaknesses in order to live another day. If you ask me whether or not this guy will do what Arafat did in '82 and opt out for a safe haven.
Just context, the PLO gets kicked out of Jordan in Black September because they're trying to take over Jordan.
Yep.
King Hussein sends the military to attack Palestinians. The PLO drives them out into Lebanon. They take over like an evil virus inside Lebanon. Cancer takes it over, starts using Lebanon now as a base camp to attack Israel, just like Jordan was. Israel invades in 1982, Operation
First
Peace for
in
Galilee.
1978,
okay, right,
Litani, and then in '82.
Okay, Operation Peace for Galilee, and Ariel Sharon, very famously, takes the military right to Beirut, and under such pressure by international community, but also military pressure to ready to eradicate them.
Yeah.
Yasser Arafat finds a way to negotiate his way onto ships and get him and his leadership out of Lebanon and to Tunis.
Yes. He weasels his way out and finds a safe haven in Tunis, and then returns as a political
So do you see
leader.
a scenario in which Israel would allow, if it's a return for all the rest of our hostages, or but do you think Yahya Sinwar is going to be is aiming for that, or do you have a sense from all the experts that you have spent the last almost 4 months dealing with in the IDF, sense that he'll go down with the ship, that he'll take a bullet before he?
I don't see him as the
he
guy
surrenders or leaves.
who would want to be pictured as somebody who snuck away like Arafat did. I don't think that Israeli leadership will facilitate it, because
Even for all the rest of the hostages.
I don't know, and I don't know if he will offer it. I don't think he will. And I hope that all of the hostages will be returned by Israeli action, and if not by Israeli action, then by the power of diplomacy and some kind of deal. But I do hope that it won't leave Yahya Sinwar alive, because leaving a monster of his magnitude alive would mean that there would be additional killing and death and violence.
You let this guy roam the countryside, as it were, wherever it is in the world. He's going to plan more than this.
Definitely. He's not going to become a philosopher.
I did say last question, but just one corollary. One of the questions that I don't hear getting asked is, how is Yahya Sinwar and his team communicating with Doha or Egypt or anybody else? Like, you guys are on top of him, essentially. It seems there's only two scenarios, and maybe you can't comment. Scenario one is he's got a communication system that we just don't understand. That's some sort of fiber optics or something that's not that, or that you actually you can hear him, you just don't know where he is, but you're just listening in, and you're not because because Israel needs the intel. But it seems it's not as a military guy, as a novelist, I'd say there's no way this guy can communicate in an environment that's of jamming, of bombing, of it. There
are still methods that are impervious to modern technology.
Really?
And once you understand that modern technology is dangerous, it leaves a footprint, and it creates, you are vulnerable because of it, then you have two options. Either to develop something that is unpenetrable, something more developed, which is very expensive and probably not within the resources of Hamas, or you can go below the spectrum and use
couriers. This is the
Osama
bin Laden
exactly
scenario.
You can use the most primitive and foolproof systems of communication that do not leave any digital residue. I would believe, and this isn't based on hard evidence, I would believe that he made the shift, the downgrade, and that he is using the most basic communication tools available. Once the information is out of Gaza into Egypt and in other places, then of course it travels through the established modern ways. But inside and to him, I think he's taking the much cautionary and primitive
paper,
way.
chalkboards, whatever. So thank you. I appreciate it. I think this is the most important manhunt in the world right now.
Currently, definitely. Yeah. And for the stability of the region, definitely.
Thank you for your faithfulness to this country, your courage, and how you've defended us and explained what's happening. Night after night, you were doing the night shift for many, many months. God bless you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joel. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So do I. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this YouTube exclusive from the Rosenberg Report.